The film Mind Thief, 2022, arrives as an intimate, unsettling entry in modern psychological horror, one that prefers quiet dread to overt shocks, and the corrosive effects of trauma and obsession to more conventional scares. From its modest budget to its lean cast and focused set pieces, the film functions like a surgical probe into the human mind, asking how memory, guilt, and the need for redemption can be manipulated, misremembered, and ultimately weaponized. The following long-form exploration offers a detailed look at the film's conception, casting, development, production, cinematography and editing, music and sound design, release strategy, reception and box office, and the ensuing cultural conversation including memes and internet folklore that followed. The seed of Mind Thief germinated in the head of its writer-director during a period of personal uncertainty. Early interviews and production notes, kept intentionally private by the filmmakers, reveal the project began as a short script exploring unreliable memory and the ethics of experimental therapy. Over several years the idea expanded into feature-length territory, fueled by the director's interest in real-world cognitive research and the subtle horrors of self-deception. The script's early drafts were character-driven and spare, focusing on a handful of central figures whose lives intersect under the auspices of a controversial therapy protocol. A central consieta, an experimental procedure that allowed selective access to a subject's traumatic memories by an outside technician, remained constant through revisions, though the particulars of how it functioned changed as the story evolved. The 2022 psychological horror film Mind Thief stands as one of the most distinctive and intimate explorations of memory, trauma, and identity in modern cinema. Conceived during a period of personal uncertainty by its writer-director, the project began as a small script about unreliable memory and the ethical dilemmas of experimental therapy. Over years of development, it grew into a feature that examines how memories shape people, how they can be manipulated, and how the act of remembering can itself become a source of horror. The central conceit revolves around a controversial therapeutic procedure that allows an outside technician partial access to a subject's traumatic memories, raising profound questions about agency and control. Casting played a vital role in shaping the film's atmosphere. The director resisted star-driven choices, instead prioritizing actors who could embody subtle interior states. The lead role went to a performer known for quiet intensity, someone capable of conveying entire histories through silence or a single glance. A veteran actor was chosen to portray the morally ambiguous therapist whose calm demeanor hides ethical conflicts, while the role of the technician, a figure who becomes the moral axis of the story, was entrusted to a relatively new face whose performance lent an uneasy innocence to the experiment. Stories from auditions reveal how chemistry and physical presence, rather than name recognition, guided these decisions. Production unfolded with deliberate restraint. The budget was modest, so every choice needed to serve both the story and the financial reality. Filming primarily took place inside a labyrinthine suburban home, a sterile research facility, and a small-town diner. These settings were chosen not only for practical reasons but also for their symbolic weight. The house as a metaphor for the human mind with hidden rooms, the facility as the cold machinery of memory manipulation, and the diner as the fleeting grounding of reality. The cinematographer worked with a palette that shifted according to psychological state: a warmth for nostalgic memory, icy blues for clinical intrusion, and distorted wide shots that bent familiar spaces into places of unease. Lighting was largely practical, with lamps and flickering neon providing intimate, lived-in textures, while the facility scenes embraced harsh fluorescence. Sound and music formed the film's most haunting elements. The composer crafted a sparse score built on minimalist strings and electronic pulses, rarely rising into melody but instead underscoring tension with silence, static, and low hums. Sound designers manipulated tiny noises, the scrape of a chair, the buzz of a light bulb, the hiss of taffy, to make the auditory landscape itself feel like a shifting memory. Long stretches without music forced viewers to inhabit the raw discomfort of characters' experiences. Editing reinforced this subjectivity with elliptical cuts and memory-like transitions, often skipping connective tissue so that events felt half remembered rather than witnessed. The film's themes circle trauma, memory, and identity. Rather than treating trauma as a singular event, Mind Thief depicts it as a fragmented narrative stitched together imperfectly over time. The film questions the ethics of interfering with memory. If identity is bound to what we remember, what remains of us when pieces of memory are altered or erased? It also interrogates authority. Who has the right to decide what another person should recall? These ideas were dramatized through recurring motifs like a cracked mirror, staged photographs that reappear with subtle changes, and the persistent metaphor of a house with doors leading to locked or distorted recollections. Reception to Mind Thief was polarizing but passionate. Festival screenings built its reputation, with critics praising the performances, its rigorous sound design, and its intellectual depth. Some lauded it as a mature, slow-burn horror film that dared to respect the intelligence of its audience. Others criticized its pacing as overly deliberate and its ambiguity as frustratingly opaque. The ending in particular sparked debate, looping fragments of earlier scenes with slight changes to suggest that nothing seen could be trusted, leaving audiences to argue whether the protagonist had achieved liberation or become further trapped. At the box office, the film performed modestly but successfully given its scale. Released in select cities before expanding digitally, it recouped its budget and earned profits through streaming and international sales rather than theatrical grosses. Its cult following grew slowly online, where fans dissected its ambiguities and spread theories about the true intentions of the therapist and the reliability of the protagonist's memories. Memes arose from the film's unsettling imagery and elliptical dialogue, often humorously connecting its portrayal of forgetting to everyday absent-mindedness. The legacy of Mind Thief rests less on financial triumph than on its cultural resonance. Scholars connected it to broader anxieties about neurotechnology, surveillance, and the commodification of therapy. Film schools began using it as an example of how small budgets and intimate settings can achieve profound psychological effects. Fans continue to revisit it on streaming platforms, discovering new details on repeat viewings, and independent artists have drawn inspiration from its motifs in music, fan art, and essays. Though not a mainstream juggernaut, Mind Thief demonstrates the enduring power of independent cinema to probe difficult subjects. By focusing on the fragility of memory and the ethics of intervention, it crafted a work that lingers like a half-forgotten dream, one that unsettles, resists easy answers, and demands to be remembered in fragments rather than wholes. The endurance of Mind Thief as a cultural object lies not just in its immediate reception but in the ways audiences and critics continue to revisit it. Unlike horror films designed to shock in the moment, this one burrowed into the subconscious, resurfacing during discussions about memory, therapy, and identity manipulation. Many viewers admitted that their first encounter with the film was perplexing or even alienating. Yet on second or third viewing, details that seemed opaque began to take on clarity, while others grew even more elusive. This paradox, offering both revelation and further confusion, ensured that the film stayed alive long after its release window closed. One of the most discussed elements in these repeat experiences was the central performance. The protagonist's quiet intensity became an anchor for the audience as the narrative deliberately fractured around them. Subtle gestures, like a trembling hand brushing against an old photograph or the repeated hesitation before opening a particular door in the house, became loaded with significance. Critics and acting coaches noted the restraint. The performance avoided melodrama, relying instead on micro-expressions, breathing patterns, and physical stillness. This economy of expression made the protagonist's unraveling both believable and unsettling, and elevated the film into a study of embodiment as much as narrative. The supporting cast also played pivotal roles in shaping the film's psychological contours. The therapist was written as a character who could be interpreted as either savior or predator depending on perspective, and the actor's ability to shift between warmth and cold detachment made them an enigma. Some scenes presented them as a confidant, guiding the protagonist toward healing, while others framed them as an architect of control, exploiting vulnerability for intellectual or personal gain. Meanwhile, the young technician embodied curiosity and inexperience. Their gradual entanglement in the experiment blurred professional and personal boundaries, raising ethical questions about power dynamics, responsibility, and complicity. Cinematography reinforced these performances. The camera often lingered too long on faces, pushing viewers into discomfort as they searched for meaning in silence. At other times, the camera drifted away, as though mimicking a lapse in attention or a moment of forgetting. This combination of intrusive closeness and distant observation made the audience experience memory's instability firsthand. The editing supported this by stitching scenes together in ways that sometimes skipped over important events, leaving only the aftermath. What was omitted felt as important as what was shown, and speculation about those gaps fueled extensive online discussion. Music, though minimal, left a lasting impression. The composer avoided traditional themes, instead layering strings and ambient tones that felt half-formed, like memories themselves. Some sequences were scored with sounds barely above silence, a faint hum or single drawn-out nota that made viewers lean in, only to be startled when silence broke with sudden quiet noises. Fans later created unofficial remixes and ambient soundscapes inspired by the score, sharing them online as study music or sleep tracks, ironically repurposing the unsettling atmosphere of the film into meditative sound. This ironic afterlife showed how audiences adapt cinematic experiences into everyday contexts. The cultural conversation around Mind Thief also extended into academia. Scholars in film studies, psychology, and philosophy began to use it as a case study. Film theorists admired how it represented subjectivity without resorting to conventional dream sequences. Psychologists debated the plausibility of its therapy technology, noting that while the procedure itself was fictional, it echoed real experiments in memory implantation and trauma treatment. Ethicists used it in classroom discussions about the boundaries of therapeutic intervention, especially the question of consent when memories themselves are unreliable. In this way, the film transcended its entertainment function, becoming a tool for professional dialogue. Not all reactions were positive, however. Some mental health advocates argued that the film flirted with sensitive material, trauma, therapy, exploitation without offering viewers adequate context or resources. They pointed out that for some, the ambiguity around therapeutic ethics might feel less like a philosophical puzzle and more like a triggering reminder of real abuses. In response to these critiques, certain streaming platforms added content advisories, and the distributor provided optional links to mental health resources. This exchange highlighted the tension between artistic freedom and social responsibility in films that deal with intimate psychological subjects. Online communities embraced the ambiguity, turning it into playful material. Memes featuring the therapist's stoic expressions or the protagonist's blank stares circulated with captions about everyday forgetfulness, procrastination, or emotional avoidance. A cracked photograph from the film became shorthand for lost memories in social media posts. These humorous appropriations softened the film's darker edges while keeping its imagery alive in digital culture. Unlike blockbuster films that inspire meme trends for sheer spectacle, Mind Thief entered the online space through subtle, niche communities that value ambiguity and emotional intensity. Financially, the film's modest box office returns did not tell the whole story. Its real success came through digital distribution. Streaming platforms gave it a second life, and international markets, particularly in Europe and East Asia, responded strongly to its exploration of memory and identity. In some countries, critics framed the film as an allegory for collective historical trauma, while in others it was read as a meditation on intergenerational memory and familial duty. This flexibility of interpretation allowed the film to resonate across cultural contexts, even though it never aimed for mass-market appeal. The ending remains the most polarizing element. By replaying earlier moments with slight alterations, the film destabilized viewers' trust in what they had seen. Was the protagonist freed by confronting their trauma, or were they permanently trapped in a loop of reconstructed memories? Did the therapist genuinely care, or were they exploiting a patient for personal or scientific gain? The refusal to answer these questions ensured the film's longevity, as debates continue online and in classrooms. Some argue the ending is liberating, others see it as devastating, and many embrace the idea that it is deliberately unresolvably just as memory itself resists closure. Even years later, Mind Thief continues to inspire discussion, art, and analysis. Independent musicians remix its soundscape, visual artists reinterpret its imagery in collages and digital paintings, and film students dissect its editing in workshops. While its commercial profile remains modest, its cultural afterlife proves that cinema does not need to dominate box office charts to leave a meaningful mark. The film's endurance lies in its ability to linger like memory that cannot be fully trusted but refuses to fade. One of the most intriguing aspects of Mind Thief lies in how its production process mirrored its narrative themes of fragmentation, revision, and uncertainty. The director reportedly maintained an atmosphere of ambiguity on set, deliberately withholding certain information from the cast to encourage genuine reactions of confusion and unease. For example, not every performer received the full script. Some only had access to their own scenes and lines, while others were given versions of the script that contained slight variations in dialogue or outcome. This unusual method was meant to simulate the instability of memory itself, the same event remembered differently by different people. As a result, when the actors performed together, their varying expectations shaped a tension that the camera captured authentically. This method was risky, as it could have led to incoherence, but the director balanced it by holding long, detailed rehearsals where intention and mood were emphasized over specific lines. Actors were encouraged to think of their performances as memories in motion rather than as fixed representations of reality. In interviews after release, several cast members admitted they sometimes weren't sure whether a take would be used or whether they were even acting in the right version of the story. Yet they credited this disorientation as crucial to achieving the film's haunting atmosphere. Filming locations contributed another layer of meaning. Much of the movie was shot in a decaying institutional building repurposed from an old hospital. Its labyrinthine corridors, peeling walls, and sterile lighting created a visual metaphor for the mind itself, once orderly, now deteriorating, filled with blind alleys and locked rooms. The set designers leaned into this idea by subtly altering the set during production. For example, a hallway might appear slightly longer in one scene than in a previous one, or a window that had been boarded up might suddenly reveal daylight. These changes were rarely acknowledged in dialogue, but sharp-eyed viewers noticed them and debated whether they represented errors, symbolism, or deliberate manipulations of perception. Sound design was equally meticulous. Rather than relying on jump scares or explosive noises, the sound team built an environment of uncertainty. Faint whispers could sometimes be heard in the background, though it was never clear whether they came from the characters' minds or from actual sources in the scene. Everyday noises of footsteps, doors creaking, clocks ticking were amplified or distorted, often slightly out of sync with the visuals, making audiences feel that time and memory were slipping. Silence itself was weaponized, with moments where all sound abruptly cut off, leaving viewers suspended in sensory voids before sound returned in distorted form. The film's pacing was another point of contention among audiences and critics. Slow, deliberate, and at times repetitive, the structure forced viewers to sit with discomfort rather than rush toward resolution. The repetition of motifs such as the protagonist walking through the same hallway at different points, each time with small variations, frustrated some viewers but delighted others who saw it as a puzzle to solve. Scholars later argued that this structure intentionally mimicked the experience of memory recall, the way one replays an event in their mind, with details shifting each time, never quite aligning perfectly with reality. In terms of music writing, the composer collaborated closely with the sound designers to blur the line between score and ambient sound. Instead of distinct themes, the music often arose organically from environmental noises. A dripping pipe, when manipulated, transformed into a percussive rhythm. A low electrical hum became the foundation for a sustained drone. The use of microtonal string arrangements added dissonance, creating a sense that the music was always slightly off, just like a faulty memory. The lack of conventional melody left many viewers unsettled, though it also inspired niche communities of musicians and sound artists to experiment with similar techniques in their own work. The release strategy for Mind Thief was unconventional. After its festival debut, where it polarized critics, the studio opted for a limited theatrical run in select cities known for supporting experimental cinema. The film drew modest crowds but sparked intense post-screening discussions, sometimes lasting longer than the film itself. Its transition to streaming proved more impactful, as word of mouth spread among viewers seeking psychological thrillers that deviated from mainstream horror conventions. Online forums became central to its reception, with fans dissecting individual scenes frame by frame, searching for hidden meanings and inconsistencies. Reception remained divided. Some reviewers hailed it as a masterpiece of modern psychological cinema, praising its ability to externalize memory's instability through form and performance. Others dismissed it as pretentious, arguing that ambiguity had been mistaken for depth. Box office numbers reflected this divide, as mainstream audiences seeking clear storytelling were less receptive, but niche circles elevated the film into cult status. Years later, its streaming performance far outpaced its theatrical earnings, illustrating how certain films find their audience outside the traditional release window. One reason for the film's longevity was the way it encouraged participatory culture. Fans created wikis dedicated to cataloging the subtle changes in set design, character behavior, and editing between scenes. Some even argued that different streaming platforms showed slightly different edits of the film, a rumor never confirmed by the studio but one that contributed to the mythology. Others developed fan theories proposing that the entire story was itself a manipulated memory, or that none of the events were real but instead projections of a fractured psyche. These theories kept conversations alive long after most films of similar scale would have faded into obscurity. The film also became a touchstone in debates about the ethics of memory manipulation in real-world science. As technologies involving brain stimulation and memory therapy advanced, journalists and ethicists frequently referenced Mind Thief when discussing hypothetical dangers. In classrooms, professors used it to spark discussion about informed consent, the reliability of testimony, and the vulnerability of patients in therapeutic relationships. By bridging entertainment and genuine ethical inquiry, the film ensured its relevance beyond the cinema. Even with its heavy subject matter, humor found its way into fan culture. Memes based on the protagonist's blank stare or the therapist's cryptic lines became common shorthand for everyday forgetfulness. Posts like "me trying to remember why I walked into the kitchen" paired with stills from the movie circulated widely. These humorous reinterpretations allowed audiences to engage with the film's unsettling imagery in lighter, more accessible ways, giving it a second life in internet culture. As it stands today, Mind Thief is remembered less as a commercial product and more as a cultural artifact. Its refusal to provide clear answers, its use of fractured narrative techniques, and its unsettling sound and visual design carved out a space in cinematic history as a film that dared to replicate the unreliability of human memory on screen. It challenged audiences to live with ambiguity rather than resolve it, ensuring its place in ongoing discussions about the role of cinema in representing inner experience. One of the most memorable elements of Mind Thief is the way its narrative structure folds in on itself, creating layers that demand close attention from the viewer. The film does not follow a straightforward chronology. Instead, it presents events in fragments, sometimes repeating scenes with slight differences, sometimes skipping ahead only to circle back to earlier moments. This structure forces the audience into the same disoriented state as the protagonist, blurring the line between what has already happened, what is happening, and what might only be imagined. The opening sequence sets the tone immediately. The film begins not with exposition, but with a close-up of the protagonist staring blankly into a mirror. A faint hum can be heard on the soundtrack, and as the camera pulls back, it is revealed that the mirror is cracked, reflecting distorted fragments of his face. This image becomes symbolic of the entire narrative: fractured perception, distorted memory, and incomplete identity. From the outset, viewers understand that clarity will be elusive, and that their role will be to piece together fragments much like the protagonist himself. A recurring motif throughout the film is the use of doorways. Many key scenes begin or end with the protagonist passing through a door, yet what lies beyond is never consistent. Sometimes a door leads to the expected room, other times, it opens into a completely different location with no logical connection. This device emphasizes the instability of memory and perception, and it creates a dreamlike logic where cause and effect no longer align. Some critics later compared this technique to the works of David Lynch, particularly in Mulholland Drive and Lost Highway, though Mind Thief applied it more systematically, almost like a narrative experiment. The middle portion of the film delves deeper into the protagonist's sessions with his therapist. These scenes are some of the most unsettling, as the therapist employs unorthodox methods that border on invasive. At times, the dialogue feels scripted and artificial, as though the therapist is reading from a predetermined script rather than responding organically. In other moments, the therapist's words echo later in unrelated scenes, as though the protagonist's memory is unable to separate therapeutic suggestion from lived experience. This blurring of boundaries unsettles both the character and the viewer, leaving one uncertain whether the therapist is helping, manipulating, or perhaps implanting false memories. One particularly striking sequence involves the protagonist recalling a childhood birthday party. At first, the memory seems ordinary. Children gather around a cake, laughter fills the air, and the young version of the protagonist looks genuinely happy. But as the scene continues, small distortions creep in. The laughter grows too loud, stretching unnaturally. The faces of the children blur and repeat, as if copied and pasted. Eventually, the cake itself is revealed to be made of ash, crumbling as the boy tries to blow out the candles. This surreal unraveling of a cherished memory encapsulates the film's central theme, the unreliability of the past and the fragility of personal history. Cinematography plays a crucial role in reinforcing these ideas. The camera often lingers too long on mundane details: a flickering light, a dripping faucet, a hand trembling slightly, as though memory itself is stuck in a loop, unable to progress. In some scenes, the camera drifts slowly, almost as if floating, while in others it jerks with handheld instability, mimicking the difference between calm recollection and traumatic flashback. The use of shadows is particularly striking, with figures often obscured or partially hidden, suggesting that important truths remain just out of reach. Editing choices further destabilize the viewer. Cuts are sometimes abrupt, skipping over transitions in ways that feel disjointed. At other times, edits overlap, replaying the same moment from slightly different angles, suggesting that even the film itself cannot decide which version of events is true. The editor reportedly worked with multiple cuts of the same scenes, deliberately introducing inconsistencies to mimic the fragmented nature of memory. This editorial style has been praised for its boldness but criticized by some who found it disorienting to the point of frustration. As the film approaches its climax, the boundaries between past, present, and imagined memory collapse entirely. The protagonist confronts the therapist in a sequence that plays like a fever dream. Rooms dissolve into one another, dialogue fragments overlap, and images of childhood, adulthood, and imagined futures collide on screen. In the final moments, the protagonist finds himself once again in front of the mirror from the opening scene, only now the mirror has shattered completely. His reflection no longer resembles him but instead appears as a distorted amalgamation of faces from throughout the film. The screen cuts to black before any resolution can be offered, leaving the audience suspended in ambiguity. The ending was divisive among viewers. Some felt it was a cop-out, refusing to provide closure. Others argued that it was the only fitting conclusion for a film about memory's inherent instability. By refusing resolution, the film forces audiences to accept the discomfort of not knowing, much as one must live with the uncertainties of their own recollections. Beyond the narrative itself, the film's cultural footprint grew significantly in online spaces. Discussion threads exploded with theories about the meaning of the ending, with some arguing that the protagonist was never real to begin with, but a constructed persona within the therapist's experiment. Others suggested that the film was a metaphor for cinema itself, where viewers' memories of scenes never perfectly align with the actual footage. The richness of interpretation ensured that Mind Thief continued to spark debate long after its release. The box office trajectory reflected this unusual reception. While its theatrical run was modest, streaming numbers surged once the film became available for home viewing. Viewers who might have been reluctant to pay for an ambiguous, experimental movie in theaters found it more accessible to watch it and rewatch it at home. pausing to analyze scenes or discuss them online. Over time, the film gained a cult following, similar to how Donnie Darko and Prime achieved delayed cultural impact. What further cemented its reputation was the way Mind Thief intersected with real-world debates about neuroscience and psychology. As public interest in memory-altering therapies and brain-computer interfaces grew, journalists often cited the film as a fictional but insightful exploration of the ethical dilemmas involved. Its release coincided with renewed scientific conversations about false memories and the malleability of recall, giving it a resonance that extended far beyond the realm of cinema. Even years after release, Mind Thief remains a point of reference in both popular and academic discussions. It embodies the idea that cinema is not just about storytelling, but about creating experiences that mirror the complexities of human thought and perception. In doing so, it secured a place not just as a film, but as a cultural artifact that continues to provoke, unsettle, and inspire. The depth of Mind Thief's characters is another major factor in its lasting impact. Each principal character is designed as a study in complexity and ambiguity, avoiding the clear-cut moral archetypes often seen in mainstream psychological horror. The protagonist, for example, is defined as much by what is left unsaid and unseen as by what is revealed on screen. His emotional journey is subtle, often conveyed through micro-expressions, pauses in dialogue, and small gestures rather than overt dramatic statements. This approach mirrors real-life processing of trauma. The mind rarely articulates its pain directly but reveals it in patterns, hesitations, and unconscious behaviors. The therapist is crafted as a morally ambivalent figure. Outwardly calm, composed, and professional, they shift between mentor, manipulator, and even subtle predator depending on the viewer's interpretation. Their moral ambiguity forces the audience to question not only their actions but the broader ethics of memory manipulation. Was their intention truly therapeutic, or were they pursuing scientific curiosity or even personal obsession at the expense of their patient? By leaving this open to interpretation, the film encourages viewers to grapple with ethical gray areas rather than offering simple answers. The technician, who administers the memory access procedures, adds another layer of nuance. Initially appearing naive and earnest, their gradual entanglement in the experiment demonstrates how good intentions can become compromised. Their arc highlights the moral perils inherent in systems of power. Even a well-meaning participant can inadvertently facilitate harm when the mechanisms of control are opaque. This character also serves as a mirror for the audience, reflecting our desire to understand and intervene, while showing how limited our perception often is. Supporting characters, though less central, are meticulously constructed to reflect differing responses to trauma and memory. Family members, friends, and peripheral figures appear and reappear, often with subtle changes in behavior or appearance that challenge the audience's grasp of continuity. These variations are intentionally ambiguous, inviting debate over whether they represent actual changes, the protagonist's shifting perception, or even deliberate manipulation by the therapist. Each character functions as a prism through which memory and reality are refracted, reinforcing the film's central themes of uncertainty and distortion. The film's production design further amplifies this thematic complexity. Sets were crafted to be slightly off-kilter, with hallways subtly longer than expected, doors that open into unexpected spaces, and furniture placements that shift subtly between scenes. Lighting was also used strategically: warm, nostalgic tones for memory sequences, and stark, clinical lighting for therapy sessions. These choices not only support narrative distinctions between memory and reality but also reinforce the psychological tension at the heart of the film. In post-production, minor visual inconsistencies were intentionally preserved, emphasizing the subjective and unreliable nature of perception. Costume and makeup design contributed additional layers of meaning. Characters' appearances are subtly altered over time, sometimes within a single scene, suggesting the fluidity of identity and memory. For example, the protagonist might wear a jacket in one memory sequence that appears altered or misplaced in another, prompting viewers to question whether they are observing a genuine recollection or a reconstructed, possibly false memory. This attention to detail underscores the filmmaker's commitment to making every element of the film serve the central exploration of memory's instability. The musical and sonic landscape of Mind Thief was designed to mirror the narrative's fluidity. Ambient drones, microtonal strings, and carefully manipulated environmental sounds blur the boundary between score and diegetic noise. In several sequences, ordinary sounds of footsteps, dripping water, flickering lights are amplified or distorted, creating a sense that reality itself is being warped. Silence is used as deliberately as sound. Extended pauses heighten tension, force introspection, and create moments of discomfort that mirror the protagonist's own psychological state. Music and sound in Mind Thief are not merely supportive elements but integral components of the narrative, guiding audience perception and reinforcing thematic content. The editing reinforces the film's exploration of memory and perception. The editor employed techniques such as repeated sequences with slight variations, overlapping cuts, and abrupt transitions to evoke the disorienting qualities of recollection. Elliptical editing omits connective tissue between events, compelling viewers to infer or imagine what has occurred, mimicking the cognitive gaps inherent in human memory. By using these methods, the film engages viewers actively, transforming them from passive observers into participants who must navigate the uncertainty and unreliability embedded within the story. The release strategy also played a significant role in shaping the film's cultural impact. After its premiere at select festivals, the film was rolled out in limited theaters in metropolitan areas known for supporting experimental cinema. Though box office returns were modest, critical response was influential. Some praised its audacity and intellectual depth, while others criticized its deliberate ambiguity. Streaming platforms later provided a broader audience, enabling viewers to pause, rewatch, and analyze the film in ways impossible during a theater screening. This approach cultivated a niche but dedicated fanbase, with online discussions, fan theories, and frame-by-frame analyses sustaining engagement for years. The film's influence extended beyond entertainment. Scholars in psychology, neuroscience, and ethics used Mind Thief as a case study to explore themes of memory reliability, informed consent, and therapeutic ethics. Its depiction of experimental procedures, though fictional, intersected with contemporary debates about cognitive science and neuroethics. This cross-disciplinary relevance highlights the film's capacity to resonate beyond conventional cinematic boundaries, demonstrating its significance as both art and conversation starter. Mimetic culture embraced the film as well. Social media communities created jokes and references drawn from key images and lines, particularly the protagonist's blank stares or the therapist's cryptic instructions. Scenes that were originally unsettling became shorthand for everyday frustrations or emotional confusion. In this way, Mind Thief achieved a rare duality. It maintained intellectual and artistic weight while simultaneously entering playful, participatory internet culture. In summary, Mind Thief combines meticulous attention to performance, production design, sound, and editing to create a fully realized exploration of memory, identity, and trauma. Its ambiguous narrative, morally complex characters, and immersive audiovisual techniques invite repeated viewing and active interpretation. By blending psychological depth with experimental cinematic form, it secures a unique place in contemporary cinema, one that continues to provoke discussion, inspire creativity, and challenge conventional storytelling paradigms. The film's meticulous attention to detail is perhaps most evident in its individual sequences, each crafted to reinforce the themes of memory distortion, ethical ambiguity, and identity fragmentation. One early scene that drew particular attention occurs when the protagonist first enters the memory access program. The sequence begins with him walking down a sterile hallway, his footsteps echoing unnaturally as the camera follows from a low, slightly tilted angle. The hallway itself seems longer than it should, with subtle visual cues of flickering lights, displaced wall hangings that suggest the environment is already manipulating perception. This early sequence establishes the uneasy logic of the world. Ordinary spaces are never entirely trustworthy, and viewers are asked to question every frame. During the protagonist's first session with the therapist, The film employs overlapping audio tracks that subtly distort spoken words. At times, the therapist's voice seems to precede his lips moving, or fragments of earlier dialogue overlay the current conversation. The effect is disorienting but also thematically precise, conveying the idea that memory is never a linear or entirely accurate record. Cinematography in these moments employs tight close-ups, emphasizing micro-expressions of the protagonist's tiny twitches, eye movements, and subtle hesitations, reminding viewers that emotional truth often exists in the spaces between words rather than the words themselves. One of the most discussed sequences involves the protagonist's recollection of a family trauma. The scene opens with a dimly lit kitchen, where light from a single overhead fixture casts harsh shadows. Objects in the room appear subtly altered from reality. A cup that was red is now a muted green, a table slightly longer than in previous shots. The protagonist interacts with these objects as if they were familiar, but their imperceptible shifts create cognitive dissonance for the audience. As he recalls the event, flashes of childhood and adult versions of himself occupy the same space, overlapping in a single frame through careful compositing and strategic focus pulls. The result is a visual representation of memory's instability, reinforcing the film's central thesis that recollection is both fallible and malleable. Another pivotal scene occurs midway through the film, when the technician confronts the ethical implications of the experiment. The sequence is framed in a stark, antiseptic room, with cold fluorescent lighting emphasizing the mechanical nature of the procedure. Camera movement alternates between smooth tracking shots and abrupt handheld sequences, reflecting the technician's oscillation between confidence and panic. The sound design intensifies the tension. Faint hums, distorted clicks, and whispers in the background suggest both the presence of unseen forces and the intrusion of manipulated memory. Dialogue is minimal, forcing both actors and viewers to convey and interpret internal conflict through physicality and spatial positioning. The climactic confrontation between the protagonist and therapist is among the film's most audacious sequences. The setting, a distorted version of the protagonist's childhood home, combines real locations with digitally altered extensions to create impossible architecture. Doors lead to unexpected places, hallways twist and bend, and objects from different temporal periods coexist in the same frame. The cinematography favors disorienting wide angles and shallow focus, forcing viewers to scan the environment for clues while remaining uncertain which elements are reliable. Rapid cross-cutting between past and present blurs temporal boundaries, heightening anxiety while emphasizing the protagonist's inability to distinguish between actual memory and manipulation. Sound plays a crucial role in the climax. Ambient drones rise and fall unpredictably, whispers echo faintly, and moments of silence punctuate key revelations. The combination of visual distortion and auditory manipulation creates a fully immersive, almost hallucinatory experience. Critics praised this sequence for its technical precision, with some describing it as one of the most effective depictions of memory disorientation in contemporary cinema. The film's ending, in which the protagonist faces a shattered mirror reflecting a composite of multiple faces from his past, reinforces the themes of identity fragmentation and memory's instability. The screen cuts to black without resolution, leaving viewers suspended in uncertainty, mirroring the film's broader meditation on the limits of understanding and the unreliability of human recollection. Beyond these key sequences, numerous micro-details contribute to the film's cumulative effect. Repeated motifs such as photographs, clocks, and reflective surfaces serve as anchors, though they are often subtly altered across scenes to indicate the unreliability of perception. Costume and makeup subtly shift the appearance of characters over time, suggesting the fluidity of identity and memory reconstruction. Even minor background actions, like a flickering light or a clock running backward, are deliberately placed to unsettle viewers and reinforce the thematic core. The post-release discourse surrounding Theif highlights the film's cultural impact. Online forums, academic journals, and film discussion boards dissected nearly every aspect of production, from sound design to visual effects. Fans created timelines attempting to reconcile the fractured narrative, while others embraced ambiguity, using the film as a springboard for philosophical debate about perception, trauma, and the ethics of psychological experimentation. In academic contexts, the film is frequently cited in courses on narrative theory, film studies, psychology, and ethics, demonstrating its utility as both an artistic work and a conversation starter about real-world issues. Merchandising and fan engagement also reflected the film's unusual positioning. Limited edition Blu-rays, soundtrack releases, and art books emphasized production notes, set photography, and compositional diagrams, catering to audiences interested in the intellectual and technical craft behind the film. Independent artists created reinterpretations of key visual motifs, while musicians produced ambient soundscapes inspired by the score. Memes and humorous reinterpretations circulated widely online, turning the protagonist's bewildered expressions and the therapist's cryptic demeanor into shorthand for everyday confusion or existential anxiety. Financially, while the theatrical release was modest, the film's long-tail performance on streaming platforms proved significant. The relative affordability of home viewing encouraged repeated viewings and closer analysis, which amplified word-of-mouth promotion and sustained its cultural relevance. International markets, particularly in Europe and Asia, responded favorably, often interpreting the narrative as a meditation on collective memory and historical trauma, further extending its reach beyond the confines of traditional horror cinema. In essence, Mind Thief operates on multiple planes simultaneously. It functions as a psychological thriller, a study of trauma and memory, a technical exercise in cinematography and sound, and a cultural artifact that encourages ongoing discussion and reinterpretation. Its success lies not in conventional metrics like box office or mainstream appeal, but in its ability to create a layered, immersive experience that engages both intellect and emotion. The film's meticulous designate from casting and performance to sound, editing, and production designate ensures that viewers are not simply passive recipients but active participants in reconstructing memory, identity, and meaning. The richness of Mind Thief is amplified in its smaller, often overlooked sequences, which cumulatively reinforce its exploration of memory, perception, and trauma. One such sequence occurs when the protagonist enters what appears to be an abandoned classroom, a set piece that, at first glance, seems mundane but is layered with symbolism. Desks are scattered haphazardly, chalkboards are partially erased, and the lighting is uneven, creating pockets of shadow that obscure the edges of the room. These environmental details suggest the fragmentation of childhood memory, with familiar structures that are simultaneously recognizable and distorted. The camera lingers on small details, a pencil rolling across the floor, a torn notebook page fluttering, heightening the sense that memory exists in fragments, often out of sequence and prone to misinterpretation. In this same sequence, the sound design contributes to the unsettling atmosphere. Ambient echoes, distant and distinct voices, and the soft, almost imperceptible hum of fluorescent lighting make the space feel alive yet unreliable. The protagonist's own footsteps are amplified, each one echoing as though in a much larger space than the classroom visually suggests. These auditory cues subtly manipulate the audience, creating a dissonance between perception and reality, mirroring the protagonist's internal struggle to reconcile what is remembered with what is actually happening. Another compelling moment occurs during a memory reconstruction session involving the protagonist's early childhood experiences with his parents. The scene is notable for its deliberate ambiguity. Facial expressions, gestures, and dialogue often appear incongruous, creating a sense of tension and unreliability. Close-up shots focus on minute details, a parent's twitching eye, the trembling of hands, the shifting gaze of the protagonist, forcing viewers to interpret emotional truth from micro-behaviors rather than narrative exposition. This technique reinforces the film's central thesis that memory is inherently subjective and that individuals reconstruct rather than merely recall events. The interactions between the protagonist and the technician are equally nuanced. Initially, the technician serves as a stabilizing presence, guiding the protagonist through memory access procedures. However, as the narrative progresses, small inconsistencies in the technician's behavior emerge, hesitations, conflicting instructions, subtle expressions of doubt suggesting ethical tension and internal conflict. The cinematography emphasizes these shifts through alternating framing techniques, sometimes using tight, confining shots to evoke pressure and control, other times using wide, skewed angles that emphasize uncertainty and disorientation. These visual cues, paired with carefully composed soundscapes, reinforce the idea that even well-intentioned intervention can have unpredictable psychological consequences. The film also employs repeated visual motifs to tie fragmented sequences together. Mirrors, photographs, and clocks recur throughout, often subtly altered to indicate shifts in memory or perspective. A mirror may reflect a character slightly differently between scenes, a photograph might show altered lighting or positioning, and a clock's hands may skip or reverse. These manipulations operate on both a subconscious and conscious level for viewers, reinforcing the film's central concerns, that memory is mutable, and that identity is constructed and reconstructed over time. One of the more harrowing sequences involves the protagonist revisiting a traumatic incident from adolescence. This scene juxtaposes stark realism with surreal distortions. Walls appear to bend, shadows grow disproportionately long, and the soundtrack alternates between silence and distorted ambient noise. The editing deliberately fragments the sequence, skipping over key moments and replaying others from slightly different angles. These techniques evoke the experience of intrusive memory and the way trauma can warp recollection, forcing viewers to inhabit the protagonist's psychological state rather than merely observing it. The climax further exemplifies the film's sophisticated treatment of spatial and temporal distortion. Multiple realities, past, present, and imaginata intersect within a single location. Doors lead unpredictably, hallways twist in impossible configurations, and objects from different temporal points coexist. The editing and sound design are critical in sustaining this layered environment, with overlapping dialogue, disjointed audio cues, and abrupt transitions creating a sense of simultaneity. By the time the protagonist confronts the therapist, the audience is already immersed in a space where memory, perception, and reality are inseparable, emphasizing the film's overarching meditation on cognitive instability. Even in quieter, less intense scenes, the film maintains a meticulous approach to theme and symbolism. A simple moment of the protagonist making coffee becomes significant. The repetitive motion, the precise placement of objects, and the soft ambient noises transform a mundane activity into a meditation on ritual, grounding, and the passage of time. These subtle sequences act as visual and auditory anchors, offering viewers brief respites while reinforcing the broader narrative concern with the reliability of perception. The post-release discourse highlights the film's cultural resonance. Discussion forums exploded with analyses of these small details, with fans cataloging discrepancies in set design, changes in costume or makeup, and alterations in environmental cues. Many viewers created elaborate timelines and theories to reconcile the fragmented narrative, while others embraced the ambiguity, using it as a point of philosophical reflection on the nature of memory and subjective experience. Academic attention also emerged, with courses in film studies, psychology, and neuroethics referencing the film as a tool for exploring memory reconstruction, trauma, and the ethics of intervention. International audiences responded similarly, often interpreting the narrative through culturally specific lenses. In some countries, the protagonist's fragmented memories were read as metaphors for collective trauma, while in others, the story was understood as a meditation on personal identity and autonomy in the face of systemic control. This interpretive flexibility contributed to the film's enduring relevance and ensured that discussions continued long after its initial release window. The cumulative effect of these carefully constructed sequences, visual motifs, soundscapes, and character nuances is what gives Mind Thief its lasting power. It is a film that rewards repeated viewing, with each subsequent experience revealing new layers of detail, subtle thematic resonance, and narrative ambiguity. By prioritizing psychological realism, ethical complexity, and immersive sensory design over conventional narrative closure, the film establishes itself as a distinctive and enduring work of contemporary psychological cinema. The intricate layering of Mind Thief continues to reveal itself in sequences that, at first glance, appear simple but are loaded with symbolic and psychological weight. One such example occurs during a seemingly mundane visit the protagonist makes to a local diner. The scene is staged with deliberate ambiguity. Patrons occupy tables but rarely interact meaningfully. The lighting alternates between warm and harsh, and reflective surfaces occasionally show the protagonist interacting with figures who are absent when the camera shifts. These small shifts in perception signal that even everyday experiences are filtered through memory and subjective cognition. The diner functions as a liminal space, a threshold between internal reflection and external reality, emphasizing the fragility of perception. Sound design in this sequence is particularly effective. Ambient noise as the clatter of dishes, indistinct murmurs of conversation, and the hum of fluorescent lighting are subtly distorted at moments, bending picture layering overlapping dialogues to suggest the protagonist's partial misremembering or internal preoccupation. These distortions are never overtly explained, requiring the audience to actively engage with the narrative and question the reliability of what they perceive. In effect, the diner scene demonstrates the film's ongoing commitment to aligning cinematic experience with the thematic exploration of cognitive instability. Another remarkable scene involves a flashback to the protagonist's early childhood. Unlike traditional flashbacks, this sequence is intentionally unreliable. Visual and auditory cues shift mid-scene, objects subtly change, and other characters' reactions appear inconsistent. A birthday party, for instance, begins in warm, saturated colors and seemingly joyful interaction, but as the scene progresses, subtle inconsistencies accumulate. A balloon that was once tied to a chair is later floating unattached. Laughter echoes unnaturally, and the protagonist's own gestures subtly change between cuts. These small manipulations reinforce the notion that memory is not fixed but reconstructed, often imperfectly and influenced by emotional state. The interactions between the protagonist and the therapist continue to develop through similarly nuanced sequences. One particularly striking moment occurs when the therapist asks the protagonist to revisit a traumatic event with no preparatory context. The camera remains largely static, allowing the actors' performances to convey the psychological tension. Close-ups capture micro-expressions, slight quivers of the lips, a furrowed brow, an uncertain glance that reveal complex layers of emotion without overt exposition. The framing, sound, and performance combine to immerse viewers in the ethical and psychological stakes of the experiment, emphasizing the film's dedication to subtle, character-driven storytelling. The technician's arc is similarly developed through restrained, detail-oriented sequences. In one key moment, they discover inconsistencies in the memory access technology, highlighting the potential for error and ethical compromise. The scene is framed using tight shots that convey claustrophobia and anxiety, punctuated by abrupt cuts that mimic the characters' racing thoughts. The soundscape incorporates electronic hums, soft mechanical clicks, and distorted echoes of prior dialogue, all reinforcing the theme of memory as a malleable, sometimes dangerous construct. Repeated visual motifs continue to play a central role throughout the film. Mirrors, photographs, clocks, and doorways appear in multiple contexts, each time subtly altered to suggest shifts in memory or perception. A clock may tick irregularly or reverse direction. A photograph may show altered lighting or positioning of figures. A mirror may reflect a character slightly differently across scenes. These elements operate both consciously and subconsciously, continually prompting the audience to question the accuracy of what they see, mirroring the protagonist's own uncertainty about his recollections. The editing style reinforces this narrative instability. The editor frequently employs overlapping cuts, elliptical transitions, and replayed sequences from slightly different angles to mimic the fragmented, reconstructed nature of memory. Moments that might be expected to progress linearly are instead repeated with minor alterations, challenging the audience to differentiate between objective events and subjective recollection. This approach aligns with the film's central theme, that human perception is inherently flawed, and our understanding of past experiences is always provisional. The film's climax exemplifies the synthesis of visual, auditory, and thematic strategies. In a sequence combining past, present, and imagined reality, the protagonist navigates a distorted version of his childhood home. Doors lead unpredictably, hallways twist, and objects from disparate temporal periods coexist. The camera alternates between sweeping wide shots and tight, claustrophobic angles, reinforcing disorientation. Sound design overlays multiple layers of dialogue and environmental noise, often conflicting or delayed, to heighten tension and emphasize the fluidity of memory. The protagonist's confrontation with the therapist is intercut with flashes of childhood trauma and imagined sequences, creating an immersive, hallucinatory experience that culminates in the shattered mirror sequence. Symbolism throughout the film is meticulously integrated into these sequences. Mirrors represent self-perception and the fragmentation of identity. Clocks indicate the unreliability of temporal perception. Photographs evoke both memory and the manipulation of recollection. Even minor props, books, cups, or furniture are positioned with intent, contributing to the sense that every detail is both meaningful and subtly altered. The accumulation of these details reinforces the film's thematic concerns while creating a rich visual tapestry that rewards close attention. The post-release cultural impact of Thief is notable for its depth and longevity. Online forums, film blogs, and academic journals dissect nearly every aspect of the film, from sound design to set continuity, character nuance, and editing strategies. Fans created detailed timelines and visual guides to track altered or repeated sequences, while others embraced the ambiguity, using the film as a springboard for philosophical reflection on memory, trauma, and identity. International audiences responded with similarly rich interpretations, often situating the narrative within cultural frameworks of collective trauma, historical memory, or personal autonomy. The film's approach to sound, performance, and visual design has influenced contemporary cinema and experimental storytelling. Emerging filmmakers cite Thief as a benchmark for integrating psychological realism with narrative ambiguity, while sound designers and cinematographers study its techniques for creating immersive, disorienting experiences. The film's impact extends beyond entertainment, contributing to discussions in psychology, neuroethics, and cognitive science about memory manipulation, consent, and the ethics of therapeutic intervention. Merchandising and fan engagement also reflect the film's unique position in contemporary culture. Special edition releases include detailed production notes, set photography, and breakdowns of visual and auditory motifs. Independent artists and musicians have created reinterpretations inspired by the film's aesthetic and sonic landscapes. Memes and humorous adaptations circulate online, often leveraging the protagonist's expressions or key dialogue for commentary on everyday forgetfulness or existential unease. These derivative works extend the film's reach, bridging serious analysis with playful engagement. The film's later sequences continue to push the boundaries of narrative and perceptual instability, emphasizing Thief's commitment to immersing viewers in the protagonist's fractured consciousness. One late-scene example involves the protagonist revisiting a long-forgotten location from his adolescence, a partially collapsed playground near his childhood home. The set is carefully constructed to reflect both decay and temporal ambiguity. Swings hang unevenly, shadows stretch unnaturally across the ground, and scattered toys appear in positions that defy spatial logic. The environment itself becomes a visual metaphor for the instability of memory, highlighting the way past experiences can linger, morph, or erode over time. Cinematography in this scene is deliberately disorienting. Wide shots are used to exaggerate distance, making familiar objects appear unnervingly distant or small, while tight close-ups on the protagonist's hands, eyes, and subtle facial expressions convey emotional intensity. A tracking shot follows him as he moves through the playground, but the background subtly shifts between cuts, creating the sense that space itself is unstable. These visual manipulations echo the protagonist's internal state, where recollection is unreliable and perception is constantly challenged. Sound design reinforces the psychological tension. Ambient noise as children's laughter, the creaking of metal swings, wind rustling through tressa are layered with faint, distorted echoes of past conversations and memories. These overlapping auditory elements create a sense of temporal layering, suggesting that past and present coexist uneasily in the protagonist's consciousness. At moments, the soundscape drops entirely, leaving only the protagonist's breathing or footsteps, heightening tension and forcing the audience into heightened awareness of the character's subjective experience. In parallel, the therapist's influence continues to manifest ambiguously. In a sequence where the protagonist confronts memories of parental conflict, the therapist appears both physically present and disembodied in overlapping cuts. This visual and auditory layering raises questions about the reliability of external guidance in shaping memory. Are these interactions real, or are they products of suggestion and manipulation? The scene blurs the boundary between therapeutic intervention and cognitive intrusion, reinforcing the ethical complexity at the heart of the film. The technician's role becomes increasingly morally complex. A critical scene depicts them reviewing recorded memory sessions and noticing discrepancies and minor shifts in the environment, repeated behaviors, and altered emotional expressions that were not intended. This revelation introduces ethical tension. The technician realizes that the procedure may be inducing false or distorted memories, yet they continue, caught between scientific curiosity and professional responsibility. Tight framing, careful lighting, and ambient sound design underscore the internal conflict, creating a palpable sense of moral and psychological pressure. Visual motifs recur and evolve throughout these sequences. Mirrors, clocks, photographs, and doorways are revisited, each time with subtle distortions to signal shifts in memory or perception. A clock may suddenly run backward or skip time entirely. A mirror may reflect multiple overlapping images of the protagonist. Photographs may show inconsistencies in figure placement or lighting. These recurring elements function as both narrative anchors and destabilizing cues, continuously reminding viewers that perception is unreliable and identity is subject to reconstruction. The climax of the film integrates all these techniques into a hallucinatory, multi-layered experience. The protagonist navigates an environment that fuses past, present, and imagined spaces. Doors open unpredictably, hallways twist impossibly, and objects from different time periods coexist. Editing alternates between overlapping cuts and extended takes, creating a rhythm that mimics memory recall while destabilizing temporal continuity. Sound design layers environmental noise, dialogue fragments, and distorted ambient tones, producing a fully immersive experience that mirrors the protagonist's fractured consciousness. In the final moments, the protagonist confronts the therapist in a symbolic, distorted reflection of his childhood home. Mirrors shatter, images overlap, and the screen finally cuts to black, leaving viewers suspended in ambiguity. This ending exemplifies the film's thematic core: the instability of memory, the complexity of identity, and the ethical ambiguity of external intervention. By refusing resolution, the narrative mirrors the inherent uncertainty of human recollection and forces viewers to grapple with unresolved questions about reality, perception, and morality. Post-release, Mind Thief's cultural impact has been sustained by academic analysis, fan engagement, and critical discourse. Online communities have created extensive analyses cataloging every subtle change in set design, editing, and dialogue, often generating alternative timelines or hypothetical reconstructions of the narrative. Scholars have incorporated the film into discussions of neuroethics, trauma, and memory reconstruction, using it as a case study in the consequences of cognitive intervention. Fan-created art, music, and digital reinterpretations further extend its reach, ensuring that its aesthetic and thematic influence continues to resonate. The film's layered, immersive approach of combining performance, cinematography, sound design, editing, and production cements its position as a unique work in contemporary psychological cinema. It functions not only as a narrative experience but as an interactive engagement with memory, identity, and ethical complexity. By emphasizing ambiguity, subjectivity, and sensory immersion, Mind Thief challenges audiences to reconsider their own relationship with perception and recollection, making it a film that rewards repeated viewing and sustained analysis. As Mind Thief progresses toward its denouement, the film increasingly immerses the audience in sequences where the line between reality, memory, and imagination collapses entirely. One particularly intricate sequence depicts the protagonist wandering through an apartment complex that seems familiar yet subtly altered with each cut. Doors that previously led to specific apartments now open into impossible spaces. Staircases seem longer or shorter depending on the shot. Hallways twist in ways that defy architectural logic. These spatial distortions are reinforced through meticulous cinematography. Wide-angle lenses exaggerate depth, while subtle camera tilts create the impression that the world itself is slightly unbalanced. The auditory design in these sequences plays a critical role in reinforcing psychological tension. Ambient sounds are layered, overlapping, and occasionally delayed, creating a sense of temporal confusion. Footsteps echo inconsistently. Background voices repeat phrases heard earlier, but slightly distorted. Environmental noises such as dripping water, flickering lights, and distant sirens are amplified and modulated to unsettle the viewer. In many cases, moments of silence are deliberately extended, forcing the audience to confront the protagonist's disorientation and heightening emotional engagement. A key motif in this section involves reflective surfaces. Mirrors, windows, and polished floors repeatedly distort the protagonist's image, sometimes fragmenting it into multiple overlapping reflections. These visuals act as both literal and metaphorical representations of memory's unreliability and identity's fluidity. In one particularly striking shot, the protagonist stands before a cracked mirror while multiple past and present versions of himself appear within the fragmented shards. This visual metaphor conveys the central theme of the film, that memory is not a fixed record, but a continuously reconstructed, malleable experience shaped by perception and emotion. Interactions with the therapist continue to escalate in intensity. Dialogue often overlaps or is echoed from previous sessions, creating a sense that the protagonist is trapped within his own mind, unable to distinguish therapeutic intervention from internalized suggestion. Close-ups focus on micro-expressions, cemented facial movements, eye flickers, subtle shifts in posture that convey internal conflict and uncertainty without explicit exposition. These performances highlight the actor's nuanced understanding of psychological realism, as subtle cues communicate more about trauma and memory than dialogue alone. The technician's arc reaches a moral climax as well. In sequences where they review previously recorded sessions, subtle discrepancies in environment, dialogue, and behavior become apparent. Tight framing, muted lighting, and distorted sound convey the character's mounting anxiety and ethical uncertainty. These visual and auditory strategies create a tension not only for the character but for the audience, prompting reflection on the consequences of intervening in memory and cognition. The climax integrates all previously established techniques into a hallucinatory, multi-layered sequence. Past, present, and imagined realities intersect within the single environment. Objects, rooms, and figures from different temporal points coexist. Doors open into spaces that seem to exist outside conventional geometry. Rapid cross-cutting and overlapping edits replicate the cognitive experience of memory retrieval and distortion. Ambient sound layers, fragmented dialogue, and manipulated environmental noises intensify the hallucinatory quality. The protagonist's confrontation with the therapist is interwoven with flashbacks and imagined scenarios, culminating in the now iconic shattered mirror scene that visually encapsulates the film's central themes. Even in quieter, more introspective moments, the film maintains its meticulous attention to detail. Small gestures, turning a key in a lock, placing a cup on a table, tracing a photograph are rendered with precise framing, lighting, and sound. These micro-actions, though subtle, contribute to the film's immersive quality and reinforce its exploration of memory's fragility. By emphasizing the significance of minor details, the filmmakers create a layered experience where every visual and auditory element carries thematic weight. Post-release analysis of Mind Thief highlights the film's enduring cultural impact. Online communities meticulously document minute visual and auditory discrepancies, often generating elaborate alternative timelines or interpretive frameworks. Academic discussions cite the film in studies of memory reconstruction, trauma, and neuroethics, using it as a case study in ethical, psychological, and philosophical debates. Fans engage creatively, producing music, artwork, and interpretive media inspired by the film's visual motifs and soundscapes. Even humorous memes based on the protagonist's expressions and the therapist's cryptic dialogue contribute to the film's longevity in digital culture. The combination of narrative ambiguity, ethical complexity, technical innovation, and immersive sensory design positions Mind Thief as a landmark in contemporary psychological cinema. By challenging conventional storytelling, the film encourages viewers to actively participate in reconstructing memory, identity, and meaning. Its meticulous approach to performance, cinematography, sound, editing, and production design ensures that the audience is not merely observing a story but inhabiting a cognitive experience that mirrors the protagonist's fractured consciousness. As Mind Thief moves into its penultimate sequences, the film fully embraces a layered, almost kaleidoscopic approach to storytelling, where every visual, auditory, and performative element contributes to the overarching exploration of memory and perception. One pivotal sequence occurs when the protagonist returns to his childhood bedroom, which has been reconstructed within the memory access system. The room appears familiar yet subtly warped. Furniture is slightly misaligned, the wallpaper pattern shifts in scale, and objects appear and disappear across shots. This deliberate manipulation of space reinforces the theme that memory is never a fixed record but a fluid reconstruction influenced by emotion, cognition, and external intervention. Cinematography heightens the psychological tension. Wide-angle lenses stretch spatial perception, making corners seem farther than they are, while low angles and tilts create the impression that the room itself is unstable. Close-ups focus on micro-expressions of the tightening of the protagonist's jaw, subtle eye movements, slight tremors in hands conveying emotion without explicit dialogue. The effect is an immersive exploration of internal psychological states, using visual language to communicate the instability of memory and identity. Sound design further destabilizes the viewer. Environmental noise as creaking floorboards, distant traffic, a clock ticking are subtly distorted or displaced, creating temporal dissonance. Layers of previously heard dialogue overlap with present sounds, blurring boundaries between past experiences and current perception. At key moments, ambient noise is cut entirely, leaving only the protagonist's breathing or footsteps, heightening a sense of isolation and emphasizing subjective perception. These techniques collectively place the audience within the protagonist's cognitive and emotional perspective. The interaction with the therapist reaches a narrative and thematic crescendo in these sequences. The therapist's dialogue is often layered, fragmented, or repeated from earlier sessions, creating uncertainty about whether their influence is deliberate guidance, manipulation, or a projection of the protagonist's mind. Close-up shots of the therapist emphasize subtle facial cues, tiny smirks, fleeting shifts and gazes that add layers of ambiguity to their moral alignment. These careful choices force viewers to question not only the therapist's actions but also the reliability of perception itself, a core theme of the film. Parallel to this, the technician's storyline emphasizes ethical and psychological tension. In a sequence where they review previously recorded memory sessions, discrepancies in the environment and participant behavior become apparent. Close framing, muted lighting, and distorted sound convey the technician's mounting unease. They oscillate between scientific curiosity and ethical concern, illustrating the moral complexities inherent in intervening in memory. The audience is invited to inhabit the technician's uncertainty, further reinforcing the film's meditation on ethical responsibility and cognitive manipulation. Visual motifs continue to accumulate, building symbolic resonance. Mirrors, photographs, clocks, and doors reappear in increasingly elaborate ways. A mirror may simultaneously reflect multiple temporal versions of a character. A photograph may subtly alter figure placement or lighting between sequences. Clocks may tick irregularly or reverse. These recurring motifs are not mere visual flourishes but integral narrative devices, reminding viewers that memory is subjective and identity is malleable. The meticulous repetition and variation of these motifs create a layered cognitive experience, encouraging close attention and repeated viewings. Editing strategies in the film remain central to its thematic execution. Elliptical cuts, overlapping sequences, and replayed moments from slightly different angles mirror the reconstructive nature of memory. Abrupt transitions and temporal shifts prevent the audience from settling into a stable narrative, reinforcing the film's core exploration of perceptual instability. These techniques ensure that viewers are active participants in piecing together the story, replicating the cognitive labor of reconstructing memory and distinguishing between reality, suggestion, and imagination. The climactic confrontation integrates these strategies into a fully immersive sequence. Past, present, and imagined spaces merge within a single environment. Doors open unpredictably, hallways bend impossibly, and objects from different time periods coexist. Rapid cross-cutting, overlapping dialogue, and manipulated environmental sound create a sense of simultaneity and disorientation. The protagonist confronts the therapist amidst this shifting architecture, with fragments of childhood trauma, adult experiences, and imagined scenarios interwoven. The sequence culminates in the shattered mirror scene, symbolizing the fracturing of identity, perception, and memory. Even quieter, introspective moments maintain meticulous attention to detail. Simple gestures, a hand tracing a photograph's edge, a key turning in a lock, a cup being placed on a table are framed and lit with precision. These micro-actions are infused with thematic weight, emphasizing the fragility and subjectivity of perception. The cumulative effect of these small details, combined with narrative, visual, and auditory strategies, ensures that every element of the film serves both story and theme. Post-release, Mind Thief has achieved sustained cultural relevance. Fan communities analyze minute discrepancies in set design, costume, dialogue, and editing, generating elaborate interpretive frameworks. Scholars reference the film in discussions of memory reconstruction, trauma, neuroethics, and cinematic representation of consciousness. Memes, art, and reinterpretations inspired by the film's aesthetic and soundscape further extend its influence, bridging analytical engagement and participatory culture. International audiences interpret the narrative through varying cultural lenses, whether as personal trauma, collective memory, or ethical inquiry, reinforcing the film's layered resonance. Mind Thief's enduring impact stems from its synthesis of narrative ambiguity, ethical complexity, and immersive sensory design. Its meticulous approach to performance, cinematography, sound, editing, and production design creates an experience where viewers are not mere observers but participants in reconstructing memory and identity. By emphasizing ambiguity, subjectivity, and perceptual instability, the film challenges traditional storytelling and invites repeated, analytical, and interpretive engagement, securing its place as a landmark in contemporary psychological cinema. As the narrative of Mind Thief advances toward its final sequences, the film increasingly immerses the audience in highly fragmented, almost surreal representations of memory and perception. One late sequence features the protagonist navigating a hospital corridor that merges reality and recollection. The corridor stretches and contracts unpredictably. Doors open into unexpected rooms, lighting flickers between harsh fluorescent and muted ambient tones. These spatial distortions serve as visual metaphors for cognitive instability, emphasizing the unreliability of memory while reinforcing the psychological tension experienced by the protagonist. Cinematography in this sequence is particularly effective in creating disorientation. Wide-angle lenses exaggerate spatial relationships, while low-angle shots and subtle tilts evoke unease. Close-ups focus on micro-expressions of blinks, lip quivers, hand tremors, communicating emotional depth and internal conflict without relying on dialogue. The camera often lingers slightly longer than comfortable, forcing viewers to dwell in the protagonist's anxiety and uncertainty, mirroring the dislocated experience of revisiting altered memories. Sound design intensifies the cognitive dissonance. Environmental sounds of footsteps, distant alarms, faint murmurs are manipulated in pitch and timing, sometimes overlapping with audio from prior sequences. These layers create the impression that past, present, and imagined auditory experiences coexist, destabilizing the viewer's sense of temporal continuity. Silence is deployed strategically, heightening tension and emphasizing the subjective, isolated perspective of the protagonist. Interactions with the therapist remain morally and psychologically complex. Dialogue frequently overlaps, echoing lines from previous sessions or blending with the protagonist's internal monologue. The therapist's subtle facial cues, a fleeting smirk, slight eyebrow raise, add ambiguity, leaving viewers unsure whether their influence is manipulative, therapeutic, or imagined. These performances underscore the film's central ethical tension, the uncertainty of external intervention in the highly malleable realm of memory. The technician's arc also reaches a narrative and ethical apex. In a sequence reviewing memory access recordings, the technician notices discrepancies in behavior and environment, realizing that the procedure may induce false or distorted memories. Tight framing, muted lighting, and distorted sound emphasize the character's anxiety and moral conflict. Their internal struggle mirrors the audience's broader engagement with the film, forcing consideration of the consequences of cognitive manipulation and the fragile boundary between scientific pursuit and ethical responsibility. Visual motifs continue to evolve. Mirrors, clocks, doorways, and photographs recur with subtle alterations, symbolizing the mutability of memory and identity. Mirrors reflect multiple temporal versions of characters. Clocks behave inconsistently, running forward, backward, or skipping. Photographs reveal altered lighting, figure placement, or object positioning. These motifs are not merely decorative but serve as continuous cognitive prompts, challenging viewers to actively interpret narrative and thematic content. Editing reinforces narrative instability. Elliptical cuts, overlapping sequences, and replayed moments from differing angles mirror the reconstructive nature of memory. Abrupt transitions and non-linear sequencing prevent narrative complacency, requiring active viewer engagement. This technique simulates the protagonist's experience of recollection, a disjointed, partial, and uncertain, making the audience complicit in interpreting reality versus reconstructed memory. The climactic confrontation is the apex of these cinematic strategies. Past, present, and imagined spaces converge, doors open unpredictably, hallways bend impossibly, and objects from multiple time frames coexist. Rapid cross-cutting, overlapping dialogue, and layered ambient sounds create immersive simultaneity. The protagonist faces the therapist amid colliding childhood trauma, adult experiences, and imagined constructs. The sequence culminates in the now iconic shattered mirror scene, symbolically representing fragmented identity, perception, and memory. Even understated sequences maintain thematic and visual rigor. Small gestures, a hand tracing a photograph, adjusting a key in a lock, placing a cupa, are carefully composed with precise framing, lighting, and sound. These micro-actions reinforce the subjective and fragile nature of perception, giving weight to otherwise mundane activities. Collectively, these details emphasize that every cinematic element, and no matter how small, contributes to the immersive psychological experience. Post-release, Mind Thief has maintained cultural and academic relevance. Online communities dissect minute discrepancies in set design, costume, dialogue, and editing, generating timelines and interpretive frameworks. Scholars reference the film in discussions of memory reconstruction, trauma, and neuroethics. Fan-created media artwork, music, reinterpretations extend its aesthetic and thematic influence. Memes and humorous references based on the protagonist's expressions or therapist's script declines further amplify its cultural footprint. Mind Thief's impact stems from its integration of narrative ambiguity, ethical complexity, and immersive sensory design. Its deliberate ambiguity, subjective perspective, and meticulous attention to performance, cinematography, sound, editing, and production design make the audience an active participant in reconstructing memory and identity. By challenging conventional storytelling and immersing viewers in cognitive instability, it solidifies its status as a landmark in contemporary psychological cinema.